I'm coming, we shall get there. But let me quickly say something. Emma Benuton, especially Larry Omoya. So let's get something very clear. If you're in Nigeria, can you be in politics? Yes. You know the funny thing? I think when people tell Yoruba people not to be conservative, to be more liberal, I think what they're doing is that they're preaching to the choir because this is what we do. That message should go to the other groups that don't practice the things that Yoruba people practice. You mentioned something, I'll quickly speak on that today. There was a man in the House of Representatives representing Oshodi Solo, Federal Constituency in Lagos, in Abuja. I mean, Oshodi Federal Constituency in Abuja. At the time, it was Honorable Tony Nwulu. It was Igbo. The idea that, they have to do something, they've always done it. People have always allowed it. Lagos has not always been like this. And I used to tell people this. If you see a dog that wags its tail every time it sees you, start barking, it's not the dog's problem. Maybe you should ask questions. Kotodoni should wag its tail anytime the dog sees you, and suddenly so I think it's important that we're not just looking at the dog and say, why are you barking? Why are you barking? How about what did you do? So when you say things like, how come they have, number one, in fact, I think it's important to use this opportunity to quickly address this. And number one, the largest landowners in Lagos till tomorrow are Yoruba people from different parts of Yoruba land. Second to them are actually the Hausas, not the Igbos. As a matter of fact, the people the Igbos will be competing with in Lagos will be the Lebanese and the Indians. The idea that you're controlling this large space and then you have a right. Let me tell you something. Say you're living in England, for instance, regardless of how many Pakistanis, Indians, black and minority groups you have in England. How did I like Black Badagry? I hope you know exactly what you're talking about, because if you can't, substantiate what you just said right now, then that won't it will not be very good for you when I respond. But let me explain something. No matter how many black and minority ethnic groups are in the UK, what the English government will do, what the British government will do in the UK is actually as cemented as anything else. And that's why you discover that even today in England, if Rishi Sunak or even Kemi Badenoch, who just won, who is now the head of the Conservative Party in the UK, if she were to go to the popular vote, she would lose spectacularly. Make no mistakes. Kemi will lose in the popular vote. Rishi will lose in popular vote, especially in the northern part of England. He will lose spectacularly, not because they hate him, but because they got to protect their own. It is human nature. It's not a Lagos or a Yoruba thing. It happens everywhere, even in the ethnic group that people are talking about. The idea that, you are here, you are contributing something, you have a right. You have no right. You think, what's her name now? Kemi will go to Manchester, for instance, and tell them, I'm as British as you. You are joking. That's when you remember that you are black. In fact, they remember that you are from Africa. The thing is, people are going to respond. And what I said earlier is this. I learned something years ago from a particular woman. She wrote a book, and she said something. She said, always walk in the middle of the road. She wrote this book in the 1920s. Always walk in the middle of the road. What she was saying is that there's an extreme right, there's an extreme left. Stay at the center. In other words, you are conservative, but you're not this one who is always hating on people and cursing them out and saying Igbos are going to hell, Hausa should get out of our land. That is not being conservative. That's being extreme. Then there's the other side where, anybody can come. They have a right just like the owners. That's not being liberal. That's also being extreme. The middle of the road is that this is my land. The middle of the road is that I have a right to protect my space. And I don't care how you feel about it. However, I'm going to give you certain rights in my land, but it stops where I say it stops. Now, if you have a problem with that, it's not because I am harsh on you. It's because you're not smart. You know why? And I said this some time ago that people who go to Yoruba land and tell people to be liberal and open, when they go home in December, they are the most conservative people you ever meet. when they hear about their land, there's a way they feel about it. That feeling that you have about your land is the same feeling that Yoruba people have about of their land, and they're as human as you. No one is saying, and that's why I said, don't tell people that they're mixed blood or move out because you are not Yoruba. No, don't say that. But also, don't come to my space and start telling me, I have a right. The people in your own house, do they have left? Everybody has a right, but there's only so much you can do in a space that is not ancestrally yours. And Nigerians have to remember that Nigeria is a collection. I've been saying it since. I'll continue to say it for as long as possible. Nigeria is a collection of ancestral spaces. Nigeria is a collection of, it is not a settlers colony like the US. It's a collection of ancestral spaces. And there's nobody in Nigeria who wants you to come and erase them from that land because, and I'm going to read something today. That's why I said, you will read some, you will hear some things, and we're going to get to it today. And when we accept that this is Yoruba land and this is what we want to have in our land, we don't have to even try to explain it to you. Like, who exactly are you that you deserve an explanation? No, I don't have to explain. It's my home. When you go home and you make your own laws, it's your home. If I ever come to your house, I have to listen to you and play by your rules in your own home. It is common sense. When you are in Rome, you behave like the Romans. And that's what really you will see in the 1940s. And I think today, I don't even know if we're going to play that music because we're already there. This is the first time we're not playing Adunia and Efretiti. But the point is, when you look at the 1940s politics, the kind of things happening in Lagos in 1938, especially in 1941, that we discussed 2 days ago, already tells you why Yoruba people are going back to history to learn how to behave in 21st century. And I remember showing you a picture yesterday. Let me show you that picture again. Anyway, we've gotten to one topic on it. So, look at this image, for instance. I showed you this image. This is Zik, and this is Papa. This is Papa, this is Sadana, and this is Zik. Now, these people in 1941, especially Papa and his people, they experienced the craziest thing because of what Zik did with West African Pilot. When he said that the reason they didn't vote for Oba Samuel Akinsonya was because he was Ijebu, essentially disrupting the old system, causing all the Ijebu people inside NYM, the Nigerian Youth Movement, to pull out, including the Igbos at the time. This was in 1941. And that's why I say, when people tell you about people things like, and you find it in this book, There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe was bold enough to write that Obafemi Awolowo started ethnic politics in Nigeria. That's not true. It started in 1941, and guess who started it? It was Zik. And what did he say? The reason they didn't vote for this person is because he was from Ijebu. And because of that...
I'll soon drop now because my phone is... Rob, please. I will soon drop now. My phone is almost off. Is this section being recorded? I'd love to listen to it later.
Yes. It's been recorded.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. I'll come back maybe later today.
All right. Yes. Thank you. So you have a situation where that happened. The first nationalist organization in Nigeria was actually Nigerian Youth Movement, NYM. It was started in 1934. And at the time in 1934, when they were having events in Lagos, one of the things that someone like Obafemi Awolowo had to do was to cover the events where Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe was speaking. And it was 3 events he had to cover. At the time in 1934, when Awolowo was only 25, and Zik was already 30 because Zik was born in 1904. Awolowo was born in 1909. At that time, Awo was looking up to Zik like, this guy is smart, this guy is brilliant, and he went there to cover the event as a journalist, and then he will write things on him. And even when certain people in the newsroom did to NY. The 4 of them were the people who would give speeches on behalf of NYM. Let's keep tapping, please. I can see the amber alert again. The 4 people would give speeches on behalf of NYM, and people loved it. But what happened was that after a while, Zik started playing a very, very interesting kind of politics, where he would undermine members of NYM on the pages of his own newspaper. Why? For many reasons. Number one, there was something called The Service. It was a newspaper of the NYM, the movement. I mean, that was the tool they were using. Not necessarily that they owned it, but it was the tool that they were using at the time. And because of Zik and because they now had West African pilot, they didn't really think about it. So they were like, we're just going to use Zik's, West African pilot because we're going to reach people. Then after a while, they said, you know what? West African pilot has a different agenda because the business. We also need to have another thing that can actually talk about what we're doing. So they said we're going to start something called daily service. And because of that, Zik had a problem with it. And he was like, why should you have daily service? You could have used my own and everything. And Zik basically made everything about West African pilot. If you ask me, maybe he was being a businessman, and that would be fair. But that's not all. What happened next will shock anybody that reads of Zik's idea of how government should work or how people should work. At the time in Nigeria, the British were occupying just about every civil service office or space. And they were trying to, one of the things that NYM was doing at the time was to Africanize the civil service. And while they were doing that, they were talking a lot about how they wanted more black people in the civil service. And there was a man that was going to be chosen to be the magistrate at the time. His name was Adetokunbo Ademola. You will know him today as Adetokunbo Ademola. But Zik wrote something in his paper. Now, Adetokunbo Ademola was a member of the NYM. But Zik wrote in his paper why Adetokunbo Ademola should not be appointed as the magistrate. He felt he didn't have experience. And even when they appointed him, meanwhile, understand the fact that we didn't even have black people who could get into that space. But the only black person who could get there, you wrote against him. Even after they appointed him, Zik still continued to write against him. And we're going to get into some things today. And he wrote about that eventually they appointed Adetokunbo Ademola regardless of what he said. But he didn't stop there. There's a man called H.O. Davis, one of the 4 people who were, the main guys in NYM at the time. And he had an issue, for instance, with another man called Bates, because while they were NYM, of course, was not just a movement, it was also a political party. They were getting people to be, by the way, everything I'm saying you can find in, there are like 5 books. So I'm going to mention the name once I'm done. I'll be telling you as I'm having the conversation. They were having, what did I say? NYM was not just a movement of young people. It had now become a political party, where every time there's a space or there's an election in Lagos, because Lagos was the only place in Nigeria where you could vote in terms of getting native people into the executive council. So NYM would present candidates just like NNDP. NNDP, of course, was the party that was founded by Herbert Macaulay. And so NYM would, want to do certain things. Zik would write things against his party. And one of those things happened where H.O. Davis had to visit Bates, a newspaper, a competitor, so to speak, to Zik's West African pilot. And after the event, Bates published that meeting, didn't necessarily go into the details. But by the time our man Zik would write about it, he called him a simpleton. You'll find this in Obafemi Awolowo, The End of an Era, by Toyin Falola Akinyeye, and 2 other guys. One of them is also an Igbo person. So that's from that book. We've been talking about Awo. We've read that book. We've read Awo, the autobiography. I told you that I picked up this book yesterday, Awo, Unfinished Greatness. We're going to read from it today. And I said some other books I will probably be talking about is The Travails of Democracy by Awo, Thoughts on Nigerian Constitution, and Strategy and Tactics. There are others, but by the way, we're going to give out some books tomorrow. So if you're in Nigeria, we're going to give out 10 books. It will be delivered to your space, to your house, or wherever you want to collect it. So we'll let you know. We are going to have a giveaway tomorrow. Money, books, and the quiz. One second, please. I'm just trying to give an overview of what we've done so far, like a recap. So what you had was that. Yes, please.
That book you're talking about, I probably would need to discuss it. I have about 15 or 20 books from Professor Wale Soyinka that I probably would send to you, so you can give out as well. We'll talk about it in the DM. Betty the Bophobia, that's his latest book, I beg.
All right.
That's all, Laura.
All right. That would be lovely. No problem. So, like I said, on maybe tomorrow we're going to have the giveaway. We'll give money. We went to give out money a couple of weeks ago. We couldn't. We're going to give out books as well by Awo. But having said that, let me go back to what I was saying earlier. So you find that in that other book. I have the e-version here. That's Obafemi Awolowo, The End of an Era. And then he called H.O. Davis a simpleton. Back to the story. Azikiwe wrote in his West African pilot that H.O. Davis was a simpleton. He would say things against the party, and then you would wonder if he was really a nationalist. And that's why when people tell you that be detribalized, This man called Awo was probably one of the most tribalized persons. Why? Because they all belonged to a group called NYM, and it was a nationalist, the first nationalist organization in Nigeria. And we're going to hear how it was destroyed this morning or this afternoon. Eventually, they started learning that this man tends to have a different way about how he, does his things. For instance, they noticed that if anybody who happened to be Yoruba were to, let's say, achieve something of worth, like a particular person two people actually, who had gone to Cambridge to study law, got back to Nigeria. One had a 2-1, the other had a 2-2. The one with the 2-2 had his name boldly written on the front page of the West African Pilot, celebrating his greatness as an Igbo person. He had a 2-2. The other person had a 2-1. He had to wait for a couple of days for him to find his own news article somewhere at the back, just one small place. Now, if that is not it, maybe just an oversight. But what you notice is that by, I think it was around 1940, there was a march between the CKC, Christ King's College, Onitsha, and St. Gregory's College in Lagos. And if you read, and we've talked about it before, but if you read Zik's account in his own newspaper of what that football match was about, you would be shocked. And I think it's important for us to, I'll see if I can find it, but if not, I'm just going to say it out to you what he said. He said that these Spartans, he called them Spartans, footballers or young boys in secondary school, these Spartans he used one very powerful adjective, and I read, by the way, Zik had a way with words. He was good. You've got to give him that. He was very good with words. So he said that these Spartans, moved over the river Niger and went through the land of Benin, and then through the territory of the Oba of Owo and the Osemawe of Ondo, through the Oni of Ife and Alake of Abeokuta and Ibadan, and then found their way in these islands to invade these islands. He used words that made it look as if they were coming to fight. And what really happened was that they won the match 5-4. But it made it look as though they had destroyed the entire Yoruba kingdom. Guess what? Shortly after then, there was another match between the same CKC boys and a team in Ibadan, where they lost 3-2. Guess what they wrote in West African Pilot? After being forced to write something about 2 days later, they wrote that those boys from Onitsha were tired, and that's why they lost. If you didn't see any sense of tribalism in that conversation, then you don't really understand how this thing played. So what Zik would do is this. Every time somebody of Yoruba descent did something really nice, they would say a Nigerian achieved this. But Yoruba people didn't have a problem with that. Why? Because they were a nationalist group, right? And this nationalist group also had, they had branches in different parts, like in Ibadan. It was the first, in Abeokuta, it was the first nationalist movement in Nigeria. But what Zik started doing was to start introducing ethnicity into it. And it got to a point where in 1941, I'm going to round up now before we get into today's conversation. By 1941, it came to a head. And this was what happened. At the time, the president of NYM was Dr. Kofo Abayomi. You will know him today if you've ever been to VI. There is a road named after him, and another one after his wife. Onyeko Abayomi is the wife. Kofo Abayomi was the husband. Now, Dr. Kofo Abayomi was actually the president of NYM at the time. But then he had to go to UK because, he was going to go for a course in ophthalmology. And it was away for so long, they had to declare that seat vacant. So they needed someone else to fill it. Now, there's a law in NYM. According to the constitution, if you were the president of NYM and there's a seat in parliament or in legislative council and you decide to go, you show your interest, nobody should contest because you are the president. As a matter of fact, that's actually how Kofo Abayomi became a member of the Lagos Executive Council. So he was the president of NYM. There was going to be an election, and then he declared interest in that election. Because of that, he was allowed to run, and he won. And then when he won, the seat of the NYM presidency became vacant. So it was occupied by Ernest Ikoli. Now, Ernest Ikoli is an Ijo man, and that's a very good information that you should remember. Ikoli was an Ijo man, and he became the head of the NYM. Now, Ernest Ikoli had employed Awolowo many years ago as a journalist. And again, remember this, they were all young. At this time, Awo was around 31. Right, so this is like 1940. No, it was around 34. This is 1941. What am I saying? No, it was 32 because this is 1941. Awo was born in 1909. So at this point, it was 32, but Ernest Ikoli was a lot older. Now, what happened was they were now saying that they needed to fill that vacant space, and then Ernest Ikoli declared interest. He said he wanted to go into that legislative council and represent NYM. Normally, what you would do would be that since you're the president of NYM, and according to the law of NYM, you have shown interest, nobody should ask you anything. They should just allow you to be there, to occupy that space. I mean, to vie for that political office. But no, there's another man in that party. Remember, I mentioned 4 people who were the quartet in NYM at the time. The first person was Azikiwe. There was Oba Samuel Akinsanya. There was Chief H.O. Davis. And of course, there was Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was very brilliant in all the deeds. As a matter of fact, when you read all these books about what Awo had all the best things to say about Zik as far as the beginning was concerned. He felt he was brilliant. He did fantastic things until the tribal tendencies started showing and it became full blown. So that by 1940, actually, they had a meeting where they were going to actually dismiss him, so to speak. But then they turned it around very smartly and, offered to resign. And then they told him, don't resign, don't resign. Why? Because there was an election coming and they didn't want to lose because they were going to need his West African pilot newspaper. They should have let him go because the following year he left regardless. And in 1941, what happened was Ikoli said, I want to run for that office. And the other man, Akinsanya, said, I also want to run. Now, they should have just said, don't worry about it. Ikoli is the president, so nobody's going to question him. But for some reason, they said, let's have an election within the party. And they had the election. Akinsanya won. Ikoli lost within the party. However, they had a caveat. They added the caveat that regardless of this election, whatever the Central Executive Committee says will be what we'll work with as far as the candidate for this particular seat is concerned. So they went for the Central Executive Committee meeting, and the CEC said because of the law of NYM, Ikoli would run because he was the president at the time, which would make sense to anybody. And guess what happened? Akinsanya shook hands with Ikoli and said to him, you're my friend, we're going to do everything to ensure that you do well and all of those things. And that was it. Until it was time for the election. And we started seeing some things in the newspaper. And you will see some of those articles. We already talked about it, so I don't want to open to that one again because there are some very nice things, juicy stuff I want us to discuss today. By the time they opened the paper the next morning, they saw something in the newspaper that was shocking. And what did they see? That NYM has decided not to, not to make Samuel Akinsanya the flag bearer of that particular party in the elections because it was from Ijebu. The first person who said no, but a particular person would not be voted in Nigerian politics because of his ethnic group was actually Zik. He said Akinsanya was not allowed to run because he was Ijebu, forgetting that Awo, who was adamantly supporting Ikoli on the basis of ideology, like this is what the law says, this is what we're going to do. Awo himself was an Ijebu Remo person, was an Ijebu man from Ikene. So think about it. Awo is an Ijebu man supporting an Ijo man, and he's now being told that the reason he supported that Ijo man is because he's against his Ijebu brother. Now, when you read that paper as an Ijebu person, Ijebu people are a proud people. Yoruba people are a proud people, naturally. And I'm not using pride in the negative sense. I'm saying we are self-assured. We're confident people. Ijebu people felt like, why wouldn't you want to vote our brother because of his ethnicity or because of his tribe? So what did they do? They went against the party while still being in the party. And like I said, as we go closer and closer into NCNC, you discover that every single thing you saw with LP in last election happened in NCNC. How NCNC was taking over, you will see is the same thing that happened with LP. Is the same game plan, is the same playbook. Am I saying this because I want you to hate people and say you're a bad person? No, I want you to know this because anytime people come to gaslight you and blackmail you into supporting some people that you don't really necessarily believe in, do not go into that mode of I'm a Yoruba, but I don't mind. That but already makes you a clown. And the reason we're having this conversation is to remove that but from your word. I'm a Yoruba and this is what I would do. A large scale, it's going to be very difficult for you to convince any outsider that you're not the same. I won't say more than that, but let me continue. Eventually, someone like Awo was threatened. They even called him a traitor. You know how they go on Twitter today and say you're a betrayal? It happened as well. They called him a traitor. Why? Because his own Ijebu people saw him as somebody supporting an Ijo man to be a traitor, not knowing that the reason they didn't let Akinsanya run at the time had nothing to do with his Ijebu identity. And eventually, thankfully, Ikoli won. And when Ikoli won, Ikoli may have won the seat on behalf of NYM, But the idea that somebody wasn't allowed to run because it was Ijebu never died. And so what happened was that immediately after that election, the Ijebu people and most of the Easterners, so when I say Easterners, please understand, I'm not talking about an ethnic group, I'm talking about a region. At the time, so in 1939, the Southern Protectorate was divided into Eastern region and Western region. In the Eastern region, you had Ikoli, who was an Ijo man. So essentially, Awo was supporting an Easterner against his own brother on the basis of principles. And the principle was that if you were the NYM president, nobody should challenge you. But after that election, Ijebu people left NYM, Igbo people left NYM, many Easterners left NYM, and essentially that's how NYM crumbled. And then that got us to start talking about the kind of structure that Awo began to have in his mind in the 40s. So yesterday we started the conversation of Awo. Initially we called it Awo in the 1950s, but I said, you know what, I think we're running ahead of ourselves. We're going to have a lot of days to discuss Awo. We're not rushing